Hey, Brandon here. I am going to do our first reading, from the new secret project. I'm not going to tell you much about it right now. I'm going to launch in to the prologue, which I'll read for you, and then I'll stop and talk a little bit, and then I'll do another reading. Right now, this has gone through various different titles. It's being called Isles of the Emberdark right now. It might just be Emberdark. It might be something else. We'll see what happens, but let's go ahead and read the prologue. Prologue. 57 years ago. Starling held open the drapes to her quarters and hopped from one foot to the other, staring at the dark horizon. She didn't dare blink. She didn't dare miss it. First light. When would first light appear? She'd barely slept despite trying. At least, she'd tried for a good 15 minutes or so. The rest of the night, she'd been too excited. She declared slumber a lost cause and had spent the time reading, waiting, distracted. In the distance, across the rolling forest of Yolen, the darkness weakened. Was that first light? Did it count? It wasn't light, it was just less dark. She went running anyway, unable to contain herself. Wearing her nightgown still, she pushed into the hallway of her rooms in her uncle's mansion, then scrambled past attendants who smiled as she passed. Starling genuinely liked most of them. She pretended to like the rest. That was what her uncle taught her. Always look for the best in both people and situations. Today that wasn't difficult. Today was the day. First light. The day she transformed. She burst onto the balcony above the grand entryway in a tizzy of white hair and fluttering nightgown, startling her uncle's priests in their formal robes and wide hats. They were up early, of course, because her uncle got up early to take prayers from those who worshipped him. Starling flitted around the corner, heading for the next hallway over, which led to his refectory. Priests belatedly bowed to her from the sides. She might look like she was an 8-year-old girl, but dragons grew slowly, and she was older than some of the priests. She didn't feel it. She still felt like a child, which her uncle explained was the way of things. Her mental age was like that of a human child her size. She just got to experience that age far longer than they did, which she figured would have been wonderful except for one thing. It had forced her to wait long decades for her transformation. She burst into the refectory, where her uncle sat upon his fanewood throne. He wore his human form, which had pale skin and a sharp silver beard just on his chin. He took the appearance of an older man, maybe in his 60s, though that could be deceptive with her kind. Starling scurried up to him, but didn't touch him. With his eyes closed, wearing his brilliant white and silver robes, he was taking prayers from some distant follower. She couldn't interrupt that, not even for first light. So she waited, balancing on one foot, then the other, back and forth, trying to keep from erupting from excitement. Finally, he opened his eyes. "Oh," he said. "Starling, it's early for a young dragonet like you. Why are you up?" "It's today, Uncle," she exclaimed. "It's today." "Is today special?" "Uncle!" "Oh, your birthday," he said. 30 years old you are, unless... Could I have mistaken the day? A lot happened during your birth, child. Maybe we need to wait until tomorrow." "Uncle!" she shouted. Frost smiled, then held out his hands for her to embrace him. "I was just speaking with Van Brasgram, and she will take my prayers for the day. I am free all day for you." "Just for me?" she whispered. "Just for you. Are you ready?" "I've been so ready," she said, "for so long." She pulled back. "Will my scales really be white when I am a dragon?" "You were always a dragon," he said, raising his finger, "whether or not you have the shape of one. As for the coloring of your scales, there's no way to know until the transformation." He smiled, then tapped her arm, which was a powder white, accompanied by her pink eyes and pure white hair. Dragons come in all colors, and each is beautiful and unique. But I will say, every dragon I've known who was albino as a human, granted, there's only ever been 2 others, had white scales to match. A metallic, shimmering white with a sheen of mother of pearl. It's breathtaking, and they are the only times I've ever seen that shade in one of our kind. "Only ever 2?" she whispered. "Only ever 2, he said, then placed his hands on her shoulders. +1, Starling. "Let's go," she shouted, running back out into the hallway. He followed, and, with her urging him on, they continued down the corridor past more smiling priests. All human, of mixed genders. Starling had been to other dragon palaces, and the priests there were stiff and stuffy. Not so here. Frost saw the best in people, and people became their best because of it. That's what he'd always said. Now, he said from behind, walking too slowly for her taste, I'm supposed to speak to you of the ritual importance of the first transformation. I know the importance. She spun to walk backward. I will be able to fly. We live dual lives, he said. There's a reason we've lived 30 years as human before reaching the age of transformation. This is Adonalsium's wisdom. Yes, yes. She faced forward again as they reached the end of the hallway and the grand balcony doors. We live half our lives as humans, so we know what it's like to be small. We live half our lives before we gain the life of a dragon. That way we'll understand. Do you? He asked. He rested his hand on her shoulder as she stood before the closed grand balcony doors, which were made of yellow stained glass. She thought she could see light on the other side from the horizon. She was so eager, but he taught her to be honest always. No, she admitted. I try, but I don't understand mortals completely. They live such hurried lives, and they are all so fragile. They don't seem to care. I try, but I don't understand. Ah, you are wise to see this, he said. With our powers, even as dragonettes, empathy is difficult. Will that ruin me? She asked softly. Because I don't understand? Will it stop me from flying? No, you can never be ruined, child. There was a smile in his voice. Never, ever. You can learn better, and you will as you grow. Knowing is how that happens, and this will not hold back the transformation. He leaned back. Sometimes contrast is important to help us learn. He shoved the doors open, and they swung outward, revealing a horizon that had begun to blaze with pre-dawn. The grand balcony was large enough to hold them in their larger draconic forms. It was one of the launch pads to the upper palace, which was built on a different scale, not for people the size of humans, but for ones the size of buildings. She stepped onto the balcony, suddenly worried. What if it hadn't happened? What if she were broken? She knew some, unlike her uncle, saw her albinism as a flaw, a sign of misfortune, proven by what had happened to her parents. You are, Frost said, so wonderful, Starling. I am honored to be here with you on this most important of days. He left unsaid that he wished her parents had been the ones. That was not to be. She took a deep breath and held out her hands to the sides. First dawn struck her, and she absorbed the light. It became part of her, and as it did, the self that had been hidden within Starling these 30 years emerged, glorious and radiant, with wings and dragonsteel of pure silver and scales of glittering white, faintly iridescent. With that, Starling at last, finally, felt that she belonged. Okay, so that is the prologue. This is a book with dual narratives and one flashback sequence. Some of you may have read the flashback sequence already because it is a short story that I wrote. What I am doing is I didn't want the short, it's more of a novelette. I didn't want the novelette, not having read that, to be something that held you back from experiencing this book, from buying this book. And so as I was thinking about it, I'm like, what I should do is I should revise that story and make it a flashback sequence to kind of bring us up to speed. What I plan to do in the book is have a little brief thing at the back that if you've read the novelette, it points out some few small details I changed so that you could skip those flashback sequences if that's something that appeals to you. But I'm trying to perfect getting the balance right for everyone to be able to read the story beginning to end, incorporating those flashbacks so that they are up to date on the things that happened before, because I am now going to read to you something that some of you have heard before. This is chapter 3 right now as it stands in the book. And here we go. Dusk arrived late to the meeting with the ones above. He climbed out of the car in front of the government offices and was met by Second of the Soil, one of Vathi's more trusted advisors, and a fairly high-ranking member in the government himself. He was an important man, even if he did let his aviar ride on his head. You again? He said. We're having important talks with the ones above, and she sends me out to fetch you? Dusk approached him, glanced at his bird, then continued on. Soil caught up on lanky legs. Tell me really, why does she invite you to meetings like this? I thought after the last incident it was through, yet here you are again. She hopes, he said. I will offer a different perspective. What kind of perspective would you possibly have? The kind, Dusk said, of one who looks in from yesterday. Where are they? The talks are mostly finished, Soil said, pointing Dusk in the right direction. The observation room, which looks out on their ship, is over here. We should be able to catch them leaving. He paused. They've said they'll remove their helmets and greet Vathy face to face for the first time before they go. Well, that should be interesting. Dusk imagined them as strange and terrible creatures with faces full of fangs. Artist renditions from the broadsheets tended to err on the side of mystery, showing beings with dark pits where faces should be, as if representing the darkness of space itself confined to their helmets. Dusk hastened his step, so Sawyer reluctantly gave him something Vathy had sent. Some transcriptions of talks that day, as typed by the stenographer. He really was forgiven. Her handwritten note at the bottom said, "I'm sorry." He read quickly as they reached the observation room. Inside, a waiting group of generals, kingmakers, and senators uniformly cast him nasty glares. He didn't care. He read the notes and realized what was happening. Vathy and the others were close to giving in. The ones above were finally winning. He read that with a sinking sense of loss. However, he didn't have time to consider further as the doors to another portion of the government offices opened and people walked out, including Vathy and two alien figures in strange clothing and helmets that covered their entire faces. They crossed the courtyard toward a small silvery ship, which is in the shape of a triangle with its point toward the clouds. Not the main ship, which was high in the sky, but this little one ferried people between the ground and the ground, like a very fancy canoe. Dusk pressed against the glass and heard grumbles as he obscured the view. This chamber was supposed to be secret, with reflective glass on the outside, but he didn't trust that. The ones above had machines that could sense life. He suspected they could see him, or at least his AVR, regardless of the barrier. He considered that he'd be allowed to stand on the landing platform with Vathy and the diplomats, but he supposed he should avoid making trouble so soon after being invited back. So he waited, watching as the aliens pushed buttons and their helmets retracted, revealing their faces. The gathered officials in the room around him gasped. The ones above were human. One male, one female, with pale skin that looked like it had never seen the sun. Perhaps it hadn't, considering they lived in the emptiness between planets. From the look of the delicate metal, ribbed like rippling waves, the remaining portions of the helmets were less like armor and more like ornament. Sack squawked softly. Dusk glanced at the jet-black bird, then around the room, seeking signs of his corpse. She squawked again, and it took him a moment to spot the death, out on the launch pad. One of the ones above now stood with her foot on Dusk's skull, the face smoldering as if burned by some terrible alien weapon. What did it mean? Sock chirped, and he felt something. This was a different kind of vision, wasn't it? Not an immediate danger, but something more abstract. The ones above were unlikely to kill him today, no matter what he did. That did not mean they were safe or trustworthy. He nodded in thanks to his AVR's warning. Toward a new era of prosperity, one of the ones above said on the launch pad, extending a hand toward Vathy, who stood at the head of the diplomats. We show you ourselves now, because it is time for the mask to be down. We look forward to many fruitful exchanges between our peoples and yours, President. Vathy took the hand, though personally Dusk would rather have handled a deadly asp. It seemed worse to him somehow to know the ones above were human. An alien monster, with features like something that had emerged from the deepest part of the ocean, was more understandable than these smiling humans. Familiar features should not cover such alien motives and ideas. It was as wrong as an AVR who could not fly. To prosperity, Vathy said. Her voice was audible to him as if she were standing beside them. It emerged from the speakers on the walls, devices developed using alien technology. It is good, the second alien said, speaking the language of the Ilakan as easily as if she had been born to it. You are finally listening to reason. Our masters do not have infinite patience. We are accustomed to impatient masters. Vathy's voice was smooth and confident. We have survived their test for millennia. The male laughed. Your masters, the gods who are islands? Just be ready to accept our invitation when we return, yes? The female said. No masks, no deception. She tapped the side of her head, and the helmet extended again, obscuring her features. The male did the same, and together they left, climbing aboard their sleek flying machine. It soon took off, streaking through the air without a sound. Its ability to fly baffled explanation. The only thing Dust people knew about the process was that the ones above had required the launch pad be made entirely out of steel. The smaller ship would ferry them to the larger one, bigger even than the greatest steam-powered behemoths that Dust peoples used. Dusk had only just been getting used to those creations, but now he had to accustom himself to something new. The even, calm light of electric lights. The hum of a fan powered by alien energy. The ones above had technology so advanced, so incredible, that the ATTN might as well have been traveling by canoe like their ancestors. They were far closer to those days than they were to sailing the stars like these aliens. As soon as the alien ship disappeared into the sky, the generals, senators, and First Company officials began chatting in animated ways. It was their favorite thing, talking. Like Aviar, who'd come home to roost by light of the evening sun, eager to tell others about the worms they had eaten. Sack pulled in close to his head and pecked at the band that kept his now graying hair in a tail. She wanted to hide, though she was no chick capable of snuggling in his hair as she once had. Sack was as big as his head. Though he had accustomed to her weight, he wore a shoulder pad so her claws could grip without hurting him. He lifted his hand and crooked his index finger, inviting her to stretch out her neck for a scratching. She did so, but he made a wrong move and she squawked at him, then nipped his finger in annoyance. She got like this when she saw Vathi. Not because Sack disliked the woman, but because Cokerly had liked her so much, and seeing Vathi reminded them of him. "I can't bring him back," Dusk whispered. "I'm sorry." It had been 2 years since the disease had claimed so many Aviar. He worried that without the colorful buffoon around to chatter and make him stick his beak into trouble, the two of them had grown old and surly. Sack had nearly died in the same disease. And then alien medicine from the ones above had arrived. The terrible Aviar plague, same as those that occasionally ravaged the population in the past, had been smothered in weeks. Gone, wiped out. Easy as tying a double hitch. Dusk ignored the human prattle, eventually coaxing Sack into a head scratch as they waited. He very carefully did not punch anyone, though he watched them. Father. Everything about his new life, in the modern city full of machines and people with clothing as vibrant as any plumage, was so sanitized. Not clean. Steam machines weren't clean. Even the new gas machines felt dirty. So no, not clean, but fabricated, deliberate, confined. This room with its smooth woods and steel beams was an example. Here, nature was restricted to an armrest, where even the grain of the wood was oriented to be aesthetically pleasing. She agreed. It's over. No more negotiating. That was it then. With the full arrival of the ones above and their ways, he doubted there would be any wilderness left on the planet. Parks, perhaps, preserves like the one he'd suggested. But in helping with that, he'd learned a sorry truth. You couldn't put wilderness in a box, no more than you could capture the wind. You could enclose the air, but it just wasn't the same thing. The door opened and Vathi herself entered, her Aviar on her shoulder. President of the First Company, the most powerful politician in the city. She wore a striped skirt of an old Elakan pattern and a business-like blouse and jacket. As always, she tried to embrace a meeting of old and new. He wasn't sure you could capture tradition by putting its trappings on a skirt, no more than you could box the wind, but he appreciated the effort. She was one of the few in the First Company who did try. Well, Vathi said to the group of officials, we've got 3 months. 3 months. Dusk quickly reread what she'd given him and there found a nugget. She had agreed provisionally to trade them Aviar. Nothing was signed yet. The ones above would return in 3 months to collect the chicks. There was time yet to do something. Maybe that was why she'd invited him. They're not going to stand any further delays, she said. Thoughts? We should prepare, said one general, for the inevitable. We've insisted they give us weapons as part of the deal. It's the best we can do. Others nodded, though they shied away from Dusk as they did so. He had punched the senator who had insisted it was time to give in to the ones above. In his absence, the others had begun to agree. Let's say we wanted to stall further, Vathi said. Any ideas? There were a few. One suggested they feign ignorance of the deadline or plausibly pretend that something had gone wrong with the Aviar delivery. Silly little plans. The ones above would not be delayed this time, and they would not simply trade for birds. The aliens intended to put a production plant on one of the outer isles, and begin raising and shipping their own Aviar. It was right there in the negotiations, and agreeing to the first step began the others. Maybe we could resist somehow, said Thule, company strategist who had an Aviar of Cokerly's same breed. We could fake a coup and overthrow the government, force the ones above to deal with a new organization, reset the talks. A bold idea, far more radical than the others. And if they decide to simply take us over? General Second of Saplings rapped his knuckles on the stack of papers he held in his other hand. You should see these projections. We can't fight them. If the mathematicians are right, the orbital ships could reduce our grandest cities to rubble with a casual shot or two. Or shoot the ocean so the waves would wash away our infrastructure. If the ones above are feeling bored, they could wipe us out in a dozen different interesting ways. They won't attack, Vathy said. 8 years, and they've suffered our delays with nothing more than threats. There are rules out there in space that prevent them from conquering us. They've already conquered us, Dust said softly. Strange how quickly the others quieted when he spoke. They complained about his presence in the meetings. They thought him a wild man, lacking social graces. They claimed to hate how he'd watched them, refusing to engage in conversation. But when he spoke, they listened. Words had their own economics, as sure as gold did. The ones in short supply were the ones that everyone wanted. Dusk, Vathy said. What did you say? We are conquered, he said, turning from the window to regard her. He cared not for the others, but she didn't just go quiet when he spoke. She listened. The plague that took Cokerly. How long did they sit in the ship there, watching as our AVR died? They didn't have the medicine on hand, said Third of Waves, the company medical vice president. A squat man with a bright red AVR let him see colors invisible to everyone else. They had to wait to fetch it. Dusk remained quiet. You imply, Vathy said, that they deliberately delayed in giving us medicine until AVR had died. What proof do you have? The dark out last month, Dusk said. The ones above were quick to share their more common technologies, lights that burned cold and true, fans to circulate air in muggy home isle summers, ships that could move at several times the speed of steam-powered ones. But all of these ran on power sources supplied from above, and those power sources deactivated if opened. Their fish farms are a boon to our ocean, said the company vice president of supply, but without the nutrients sold by those above, we can't keep the farms running. Their medicine is invaluable, said Third of Waves. Infant mortality has plummeted. Literally thousands of our people live because the ones above have traded with us. When they were late with the power shipment last month, Dusk said, the city slowed to a crawl, and we know that was intentional from the accidentally leaked comments. They want to reinforce to us their control. They will do it again. Everyone fell silent, thinking, as he wished they'd do more often. Sock squawked again, and Dusk glanced at the launch pad. His corpse was still out there, lying where the ones above had left, burned and withered. Show in the other alien, Vathy said to the guards. Other alien? What? The two men at the door, with security AVR on their shoulders and wearing feathers on their military capes, stepped out of the room. They returned shortly with an incredibly strange figure. The ones above had worn uniforms and helmets, unfamiliar clothing but still recognizable. This creature stood 7 feet tall and was encased entirely in steel. Armor of a futuristic cast, smooth and bright, soft violet blue at the joints. The helmet glowed at the front from a slit-like visor with an arcane symbol, reminding Dusk vaguely of a bird in flight, etched into the front of the breastplate. The ground shook beneath this being's steps as it entered the room. That armor was surreal, like interlocking plates that somehow produced no visible seam. Just layered pieces of metal, covering everything from fingers to neck. Obviously airtight, with a rounded cast, the outfit had stiff iron hoses connecting helmet and armor. The other aliens might have looked human, but Dusk was certain this alien was something frightful. It was too tall, too imposing to be human. Perhaps he was not facing a man at all, but instead a machine that spoke as one. You did not tell those you call the ones above that you have met me, the alien said, projecting a male voice from speakers at the front of the helmet. The voice had an unnatural timbre to it, not an accent, like someone from a backwater island, but still an uncanny air. No, Vathy said, but you were right. They ignored each of my proposals and acted as if the deal were already done. They intend to set up their own facility here. They intend far more than you know, the stranger said. Tell me, is there a place on your planet where people vanish unexpectedly? A place, perhaps, where an odd pool collects something that is not quite water? Dusk felt a chill. He did his best not to show how much those words disturbed him. You have only one gem with which to bargain, people of the Isles, the alien said, and that is your loyalty. You cannot withhold it. You can merely determine to whom you offer it. If you do not accept my protection, you will become a vassal of the ones above. Your planet will become a farming station, like many others, intended to feed their expansion efforts. Your birds will be stripped from you the moment it becomes possible to do so. And you are offering something better, Vathy said. My people will give you back 1 out of 100 birds born, the armored alien said, and we will allow you to fight alongside us, if you wish, to gain status and elevation. 1 in 100? Second of Sapling said, the outburst unsettling his gray and brown AVR. Robbery! Choose, the alien said. Cooperation, slavery, or death. And if I choose not to be bullied? Sapling snapped, reaching to his side for the repeating pistol he carried in a holster. The alien thrust out his armored hand, and smoke or mist coalesced there out of nowhere. It formed into a gun, longer than a pistol, shorter than a rifle, wicked in shape, with flowing metal along the sides like wings. It was to Sapling's pistol what a shadowy beast of the deep might be to a minnow. The alien raised his other hand, snapping a small box, perhaps a power supply, into the side of the rifle, causing it to glow ominously. Tell me, President, the alien said to Vathy, what are your local laws regarding challenges to my life? Do I have legal justification to shoot this man? No, Vathy said, firm, though her voice was audibly shaken. You do not. I do not play games, the alien said. I will not dance with words like those Scadrians. You will accept my offer, you will not. If you do not, you join them, and I will have legal right to consider you enemies. The room remained still. Sapling carefully edging his hand away from his sidearm. I do not envy your decision, the armored alien said. You have been thrust into a conflict you do not understand. But like a child who has found himself in the middle of a war zone, you will have to decide which direction to run. I will return in 1 month, local time. The colored portions of the creature's armor glowed more brightly, a blue far too inviting to come from this strange being. He lifted into the air a few inches, then pulled the power pack from his gun. The weapon vanished in a puff of mist. He left without further word, gliding past the guards, who stepped away and didn't impede him. What was that? Dust demanded. He arrived early this morning, Vathy said, with a simple offer, no negotiating. She hesitated. He arrived without a ship. He doesn't appear to need one to travel the stars. He flew down out of the sky under his own power. Or of that armor, one of the kingmakers said. He didn't know her name. Perhaps that armor. The guards took up position at the door again, sheepishly holding their rifles. They knew, as everyone in the room did, that no guard would stop a creature like that one if he decided to kill. Vathy pulled a chair over to the room's small table, then sat down in a slumping posture. Her aviar, Miris, crawled anxiously across her back from one soldier to the other. This is it, she whispered. This is our fate, caught between one ocean wave and the breaking stone. This job had weathered her, thus missed the woman who had been so full of life and optimism for advances of the future. Unfortunately, she was right, so there was no sense in offering meaningless aphorisms. Besides, she had not asked a question, so he did not respond. Sek chirped, and a body appeared on the table in front of Vathy. Dusk frowned. Then that frown deepened, because the corpse was not his. Never, in all his time bonded to Sek, had she shown him anything other than his own corpse. Even during that dangerous time years ago when her abilities had grown erratic, even then, she'd shown Dusk only his own body. He stepped across the room, and Vathy looked up at him relieved, as if she expected him to comfort her. She furrowed her brows when he ignored her to study the body at the table. It was female, very old, with long hair having gone white. The corpse wore an unfamiliar uniform after the cut of the ones above, commendations on the breast pocket, but in another language. It's her, he thought, recognizing the aged face. Vathy, some 40 years in the future. Dead, dressed for a funeral. Dusk, the living Vathy said. What do you see? Corpse, Dusk said, causing others in the room to murmur. They were uncomfortable with Sek's power, which was unique among AVR. He knew some disbelieved it existed. That's wonderfully descriptive, Dusk, Vathy said. One might think that after this many years, you might learn to answer with more than one word when someone talks to you. He grunted, walking around the vision of the corpse. The dead woman held something in her hands. What was it? Corpse, he said, then met the living Vathy's eyes. Yours. All right. So that's chapter 3. By then, you will have gotten a glimpse of Dusk from 8 years ago. And you will have come to know him a little bit in this current continuity of this book. And then we get that chapter, which I have done a reading of part of that chapter before. So we're now going to jump to chapter 11. This won't be terribly much spoilers because this is going to be the first time you see Starling again after that prologue. And I'm going to do that one, and I think this is our last of the sample chapters. So, Chapter 11. Starling crawled down the ladder in a metal tube, far from her homeworld, and even further, at least emotionally, from that glorious day when she'd first transformed. Over 50 years had passed. She was basically an adult, but she had replaced grand palaces with dimly lit corridors on a half-functioning starship. She reached the bottom and turned toward engineering, wearing her human shape, a shape she'd not been allowed to leave for 12 years now. She forced a spring to her step and told herself to keep positive. There was at least one blessing about being exiled. It turned out that there were a whole lot of places that weren't home, and many of them were vibrant, magnificent, and amazing. She'd never have visited them if she hadn't been forced out into the Cosmere against her will. For that, she had decided to be grateful for what had been done to her. Her master said she worked too hard to find sunlight in dark places, but what else was she to do? Darkness was too easy to find, and she preferred a challenge. Besides, the Cosmere really was a wondrous place. Not that her current location was anything spectacular. A metallic corridor with flickering fluorescent lights, pipes for decor, and barely enough space to walk upright. Took a lot of energy to keep a ship like the Dynamic flying, and designers learned to be economical. She paused by one of the portholes, gazing out at the bleakness of Shadesmar, an endless black plain with no curvature or horizon. Darkness. Wasn't it the darkness that reminded one of how wonderful the light was? Traveling through Shadesmar was dreary at times, but at least she could do it in a ship, rather than walking in a caravan like people had done in the olden days. She tried to imagine them out there on the obsidian ground, walking across the lonely expanse. Or worse, straying out into regions where the ground went incorporeal and turned into a misty nothing called the Unsea, or the Emberdark, they sometimes called that vast emptiness, the unexplored parts of Shadesmar. Here on the more frequented paths, the ground solidified. It had been that way for millennia. You often encountered other travelers on these patrolled lanes between planets. For Shadesmar, such places were conventional, understood, and safe. But her ship had strayed close to the edges of one such corridor, and out there, well, anything could be out there in the Emberdark. Starling found that both exciting and terrifying all at once. A figure stepped out of the wall beside her, transparent, with a faint glow to him. Naz had pale skin and wore a black formal suit, the kind with a fancy cravat that normal people wore only to the most exclusive of gatherings. He didn't have much choice as to do so all the time, though, seeing as that is what he had died in. "Star," he asked her, "is everything all right?" "It's strikingly beautiful," she said, stopping along the hallway, running her fingers along the metal. "This corridor." Moving, let the sleeve of her jacket slip back, exposing one of her manacles. Silver against her powder white skin, the thick pieces of metal, more like bracers really, were the symbols of her exile, binding her into her human form, locking away her abilities, until she, quote-unquote, learned. She still didn't know, years later, how much the exile was to punish her and how much was to teach her. Her people's leaders could be obscure about such matters. "Strikingly beautiful," Naz said. "The corridor. Star, are you having one of your moments?" "No," she said. "Maybe. Look, I was thinking that this ship is almost starting to feel like home to me." "The dragon," he said with a smile, "who flies a starship." "I don't do much of the flying. That's Leonora's job. I just get flown around." 12 years now, trapped in her human form by these manacles. 12 years since she stretched her wings and taken to the sky under her own power. Shards. She would not let that break her. She would not let them win. She continued on her way, Naz joining her. He didn't walk, and he didn't really float. He glided, feet on the ground as if standing still, but moving when she walked, hands clasped behind his back. "I shouldn't complain," she said. "I mean, there are advantages to letting someone else do the flying. Easier on the muscles this way. Plus, I can sleep while we travel. Try doing that when flying with your own wings." "Star, dear, if I had a stomach, I believe I'd find your optimism nauseating." "Oh, come on," she said. "You have to admit, things could be worse. I could be dead." "One gets over such trivialities. Wearing a formal suit for eternity, I'll never be underdressed. And have a face that is, well, you know." Naz stopped in place. "I know what?" "Never mind," she said, reaching the ladder to the bottom deck. She climbed down it while he floated alongside her. "Never mind what?" he said. "It wouldn't be polite to say." "You were trained by one of the most obtuse, crass men in all of the Cosmere, Star. You don't know the meaning of the word polite." "Sure I do," she said, hopping off the ladder. "It's just that I'm a kindly young woman." "You're 87, and you're not a woman." "I'm a kindly young for the relative age of her species, person with a humanoid female appearance. And being kindly means that you don't tell your friend about the unfortunate nature of his sideburns. You merely imply they are ugly so you can maintain plausible deniability. He followed, eyes forward as they reached the door to engineering. They were quite fashionable when I died. Among whom? Warthogs? He almost broke composure. That stern look of near disapproval cracked, and a smile itched at the corners of his mouth. It always felt like a gift when she managed to make Naz smile. Also, the sideburns weren't actually that bad. They had a stately, classic air. It was just that he was overly fond of them. Hey, a commanding female voice said in Star's earpiece. Are you wasting time again? No, Captain. Then why isn't my engine working? Had to stop by my rooms to fetch something, Captain, Starling said. I'm almost engineering. Did Nazraloff find you? Yes, Captain. I explicitly told him not to. Tell her, Naz said. She can order me 100 lashings. I'm fond of them. They tickle. Sorry, Captain, Starling said instead. I'm at engineering now. Warn that engineer, the captain said, that if there's another problem, I will come down and deal with her personally. I'm not known for my patience with crew who slack off. She kept the line. Do you suppose, Naz said, we could pitch her overboard and claim she jumped? I'd swear under oath that she was driven mad. By what? My ravishingly attractive sideburns. He hesitated. I mean, there has to be some warthog in the captain's heritage. Have you seen the woman? Starling grinned, then pushed in through the door. The engine room to the dynamic was even more cramped than the hallway. Though it had a higher ceiling, the round chamber was clogged with machinery. Starling had to squeeze between engine protrusions in the wall at several points, making her way back to where a hammock hung from a rivet on the wall and a stack of large barrels marked with various symbols of Aethers. A young woman sat up from within the hammock and hurriedly hid some items in the pocket of her blue jumpsuit. Aditl had brown skin and wore her dark hair in a braid. As she moved, Starling caught the distinctive pale blue, glass-like portion of her left hand. The center of the palm replaced, bones and all, with a transparent aether the color of sky. The glass was cracked, an indication that the symbiote she'd bonded was dead. Starling had never asked for the story behind that. LT, the girl exclaimed. Oh, hells, Captain sent you? Did I let the pressure lapse again? She scrambled, grabbing her earpiece from the pouch in her hammock, fumbling to put it in. Sorry. Aditl fumbled further as she slid out of the hammock, almost falling over. She hopped over a large pipe and began to monitor the engines, which she was supposed to have been doing. The old machinery needed constant attention. The dynamic, as fond of Starling was of it, wasn't exactly the most cutting edge of ships. Indeed, it was something of a mongrel. Rosharan anti-grav technology, Dahatrian Aethers for providing thrust and engine power, a Scadrian composite metal hull. Never mind that all three technological strands had produced their own viable starships without the others. The dynamic, like her crew, had picked up a little here and a little there. Really, it was all it was missing was an awakened metal mind, but those were expensive, and Starling had never trusted them anyway. Aditl fiddled with the machinery, checking gauges and aether levels until she got the engine up to full power. Starling leaned against the wall, noting that Naz had chosen to remain outside. Aditl was new, and he had learned, from painful experience, to ration his time with new crew members. Not everyone was comfortable with shades. Indeed, there were some who'd say that bringing one on board your ship was tantamount to suicide. So, Starling said, this is the third time this week the captain hasn't been able to get a hold of you? Sorry. Aditl kept her head low as she worked. Want to talk about it? I'll do better. I need this job, LT. Please. I need to be able to save up enough. Starling folded her arms, leaning against the metal wall, the cuffs of her manacles peeking out from beneath her jacket. Aditl worked for a moment longer, but then slumped as she knelt on the floor beside her equipment. She leaned forward, forehead against the engine. A low humming sound came from within the machinery as it used Zephyr Aether to generate gas, which created pressure, which was the basis for powering the ship. The fact that they could also use Zephyr as propellant and for breathable air meant the dynamic was spaceworthy. They rarely needed that, as Zysis, the ship's owner, usually had them do merchant runs through Shadesmere, which had its own atmosphere. They're pictures of your family, aren't they? Starling said. The things you hide whenever I walk past. Aditl glanced at her, surprised. Can I see them? Starling asked. Sheepishly, the young woman fished them out of her pocket and handed them over. Only 4 photos, depicting a crowded family with 7 children. Aditl appeared to be the oldest. Her parents were smiling in every one, wearing the colorful clothing common to people of her planet. They didn't want me to go, Adidal said. Said I was too young, even if I'd done the apprenticing, but after. She looked at her hand, pressed flat on the ground, and the cracked aether bud left in the palm. I couldn't stay. I took the deal to work for Passage Off-World, but do you have any idea how much it cost to get back to Dahatri? I didn't. Stupidly, I left my family, and with them, the one place where anyone has ever wanted me. Hey, Starling said, kneeling. You're wanted here. I shouldn't be, Adidal said. I screwed up every duty I've ever been given. You deserve a real engineer with real experience and a functional aether. Adidal, do you think we can afford a full aether bound on this old piece of junk? She's not a piece of junk, Adidal put her hand in the engine. She's a good ship, LT. Now, that was encouraging. You always wanted an engineer who cared about the ship. Either way, Starling said, you're a blessing to us here. A fully trained aether bound? Without a functioning aether. Either way, we get your knowledge and your skill. You always get the aether working again when you try. I talked to it, she said softly. You can only afford older spores, the kind that tend to be drowsy. I wake them up, that's all. She turned away. I'm broken, LT, ruined. You can never be ruined, Starling said, taking her by the hand. Hey, look at me. Never, ever, Adidal. It's impossible. Then she shrugged. But here, we're all a little off, eh? We're family regardless. Starling had let her jacket sleeves retreat, and Adidal saw the manacles, thought a moment, then nodded. Thanks for the pep talk, LT, Adidal said, pulling away to work at her post. I'll stay on it, won't let you down. Well, good, Starling said. That's what Captain wants. She handed back the pictures, then slipped something out of her own inner jacket pocket, an envelope, fetched from her room earlier. Adidal took it with a frown, looking to Starling, then opened it. It took a moment for her to register what was inside. When she did, her eyes widened and her hand went to her lips, covering a quiet gasp. 1 Dickett, 2 Dahatri, Adidal's homeworld. But how? Adidal asked. Why would you? Nobody, Starling said softly, on my ship is trapped here. Everybody on my ship has the right to go home. You're a great engineer, Adidal, and I love having you on this crew. But there's another place that you need to be. Well, she nodded toward the ticket. But what does Captain think? Captain doesn't need to know, Starling said. You're not our slave, Adidal. You're our friend and colleague. She stared at the ticket, tearing up. How long have you known how homesick I was? I made a good guess. I did buy a refundable ticket in case I was wrong. She gave Adidal a squeeze on the shoulder. When we get to Silverlight, I'll sign your release papers. You can return home until you're ready to leave again, if ever. Adidal closed her eyes, tears leaking down her cheeks. Starling smiled. For now, though, please just keep the ship moving. Captain keeps threatening to come down here herself, and I think she might actually do it next time. Thank you, LT, she whispered. Starling, thank you. Starling left Adidal working with renewed vigor, then stepped out of engineering to where Naz was waiting, one eyebrow cocked. What? She asked him. How did you afford that? It was expensive to travel to Dahatri. The law of commerce was this. If you could get to a location through Shadesmart, it was cheap. If not, you had to pay. A lot. Most cities were in the physical realm, not in Shadesmart, but you could transfer between the two dimensions with ease if you had a special kind of portal. They were called perpendicularities, and most major planets had them. So traveling was simple. Pop into Shadesmart at one planet, travel easily through to your destination, pop back out. Unfortunately, Dahatri didn't have a perpendicularity anymore, which meant you couldn't travel there using conventional ships like the Dynamic. Or well, you could travel through Shadesmart to the location of the planet, but you couldn't hop out and visit it. To get to Dahatri, you needed an expensive, faster-than-light capable ship that could travel through space in the physical dimension. Those were expensive, and mostly controlled by one military or another. Hence why Adidal could catch a ride on one leaving, a ship that had needed a post filled and had recruited her, but to get back, your only reliable way was to buy an overpriced ticket, as every ship traveling there knew how valuable their seats were. Well, Naz asked as they started walking and floating. How did you afford it? I had a bit of savings, she said. You realize, he replied, this is only going to convince them further that you have a hoard of gold somewhere. Shards, she hadn't thought of that. Their crew was small, only 8 people, but the myth about Starling's kind and their caverns of gold had persisted among them no matter how much she tried to stamp it out. At least they believed her when she'd insisted that dragons didn't eat people. She climbed the ladder to the middle deck. Truth was, it felt good, having guessed accurately what Adidal needed. She was finally starting to feel like she understood the crew and how it was to be a leader, like Master Hoyt had been trying to teach her. Before he'd vanished, of course. It was his way. He'd be back. Until then, she had to do her best to guide the crew and protect them from the interim captain. Starling reached the middle deck and walked through the hallway toward the stern, where she could climb up into the bridge. As she did, though, she spotted someone standing outside the medical bay, peering in. Tzitzit was a Lonarch, a kind of being that was basically human, except instead of hair, he had feathers. A mostly bald head, with dark brown skin and a crest of yellow and white feathers on the very top. Tiny feathers along his arms, almost invisible against his dark skin. Arcanus said the Lonarch hadn't evolved from birds or anything like that. More, they were humans who had been isolated and whose hair had evolved to something akin to feathers. Tzitzit was supposed to be checking on the light support systems. While Adidal handled the aethers and the engine itself, Tzitzit was the technician for the rest of the ship. He was a genius at that sort of thing, when he wasn't getting distracted by the ship's doctor. He spotted Starling and Naz as they approached, and his crest perked up in alarm. Then he stepped forward to meet her. "Yes," he said before she could ask. "Yes, I was checking on the doctor again. Yes, I know you said I shouldn't be worried. I can't help it, LT. We shouldn't have one of those on our ship." "Z," she said, taking him by the arm. "Have you listened to yourself when you talk like that?" I know, he said, crest smoothing back down. "I'm sorry, it's just, LT, you know what they did to my people, to my world." She nodded, and she did. She'd never been to his homeworld, amazing though it sounded, but she knew what the Hordes had done to other planets. It was a familiar story. "Master Hoyt," Starling said, "trusts Chrysalis. He invited her on board." Tzitzit shivered at the name, and even Naz looked away. It said something that there was a dragon and a shade on board the ship, but the crew were frightened of the ship's doctor. "I found one of her spies," Tzitzit whispered, "in my room again." Well, that was a problem. Chrysalis did have difficulties with privacy. "I'll speak to her," Starling said. She'd made a breakthrough finally with the Adidal earlier. Could she manage another? "Star," Naz said softly, "you need to stop worrying about that one. The Horde will be gone from the ship as soon as Isis finds us a proper ship's doctor." "Master Hoyt told me to watch over the crew." "That's not a member of the crew," Tzitzit said. "It's... LT, just trust me. It isn't here to help us. It doesn't care about us, except how it can use us to further some mysterious goal." "We'll see," Starling said. "You two head up to the bridge. I'll meet you in a bit." Both reluctantly withdrew. Starling stepped up to the medical bay, peering in at a figure who wore a tight, formal uniform from military Starling hadn't ever been able to identify. The individual worked at a cabinet, cataloging their medicines, as Captain had asked. As the figure heard Starling enter, it turned, revealing a face with the skin pulled back and a network of insects underneath. All right. So, there we are. What is this book? Well, you might be able to find the word Emberdark used somewhere in the previous books. It's been around for a little while. I've been imagining this place between populated parts of Shadesmar as a very interesting darkness to explore. And we are going to have a book that maybe looks at that a little bit. So it is a novelization of Sixth of the Dusk, but it includes that story as a flashback sequence. It takes place in the future era space age of the Cosmere, and it has a dual narrative between Starling and Dusk himself. And so I hope that you guys will enjoy reading this. That is what the book is. It's a lot of fun. My beta readers have really enjoyed it. I think that you will too. That said, you either need to be okay with some of this being a little unfamiliar, or I'd recommend a little bit of reading in the Cosmere, just to kind of familiarize yourself with how the Cosmere works and how some of the magics work. You won't need to know too much, right? Like, this can stand on its own. It will explain everything that you need, and everything else is Easter eggs, but those Easter eggs are becoming more and more prevalent and a little more obvious than they used to be, shall we say. So that is a couple chapters from Isles of the Emberdark, and we'll release a little bit more with our newsletter. So if you aren't signed up for that, you should sign up for that, and you'll get a little more taste. And I hope that if you're interested, you will back the crowdfunding campaign and pick up a copy, which will ship out sometime late spring, early summer next year. Thank you very much.